Chapter 2, Being Ethical and Socially Responsible. So in this chapter, we will look at and define business ethics, and we'll discuss some really important manners in which ethical decision-making can be encouraged in an organization, and look at how both ethical thinking and laws have changed over the years.
On black. Yes, you did. We started with $20. Well, we started with $20. You know, how much is the mile now? $2.75? You know what? What? Some people don't like to take responsibility for their shit. They blame everything in their life on somebody else.
That was Uber CEO Travis Kalanick sort of unloading on one of his drivers. Uber, if you've been following the news, has had quite a wealth of ethical issues to deal with lately. So I'd like us to look at that in a little bit. But first, I want to ask you what business ethics is. Well, you could say it's the application of moral standards to business situations. In other words, what's the correct thing to do here? How do we balance the rights and needs of our employees with those of our stockholders? Who determines what moral standards businesses should be held to? So there's the economic viewpoint that says businesses are just in business to make a profit, and there's the socioeconomic viewpoint that says, you know, as a corporate citizen, we have the obligation to do a little bit more than just make a profit. We have to do the right thing. Ethical issues entail questions of fairness and honesty, organizational relationships, conflicts of interest, and communications. Conflicts of interest, I think, is a biggie. And once again, if you've been following the news, not only in the business realm, but in the political realm, you see quite a bit on how conflicts of interest can be problematic. And I don't want to get into those for many, many reasons. But I'll give you an example of a business conflict of interest. Let's say that your corporation is looking to buy land in Nevada. Your family just happens to have a parcel for sale in that state, and you steer the company that way without disclosing that your cousin actually owns it. That's a pretty obvious conflict of interest, because you have to balance the company's interest at getting the best deal on the land with your interest of helping your family out. So it can be tricky, to say the least. Let's look at some factors affecting ethical behavior. And specifically, I'd like to suggest that ethics can be examined at the individual level, at the social level, and at the opportunity level. In a minute, I'm going to include a link to a video on the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of the United States, which was pulled off by Bernie Madoff. Oftentimes, I also talk about the fraud at Enron and in similar cases. And I use those instances to suggest that many times ethical behavior or misbehavior, as the case may be, is shaped by a certain type of individual. And specifically, there's 1 to 4% of the population that really don't have a conscience. And those are alternatively referred to as psychopaths or sociopaths. The Hollywood view is that a psychopath or a sociopath is, something like a serial killer. And it's certainly not always the case. In fact, it's just somebody without a conscience who has this unbridled need for power. So oftentimes they do find themselves in the corner office. And when you see kind of an extreme case of greed, then it's safe to assume that individual factors are at play. But I think we assume all too readily that if someone is a quote-unquote good person, they won't do bad things. And unfortunately, history and research have shown us that's simply not the case. In the right situation, a very good person can act very, very wrong. And so that brings up the issue of social factors. And that's very, very important to understand the impact of social factors in attempting to shape an ethical organization. So there have been myriad really fascinating studies on social impact of behavior. And it explains some of the issues, like, coming back to Bernie Madoff. Initially claimed it was just him that pulled off this 20-year Ponzi scheme. And of course, it wasn't just him. There were a number of other folks that were complicit. Same thing with Enron. There were many, many people who were not necessarily bad people who were complicit. Even more egregious examples like the abuse at Abu Ghraib. You can have very good people doing very bad things. So one of the attempts to answer the question, can good people do bad things, was something called the Milgram experiment. And let me show you a real brief clip from that.
Sad face.
That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice.
Actually, the Milgram experiment was set up as a way of attempting to understand why everyday Germans were complicit in the atrocities of World War II. And so what they did is they had an individual in the other room who was actually complicit in the experiment, but the subject didn't know that. The subject was told that the guy in the other room was supposed to learn a series of words. And the subject, in order to teach him the words, was supposed to shock him when he got one wrong. So it's really interesting to note that not one single person attempted to stop the process. None of them said, oh my God, this is inhumane. And in fact, the majority continued to do what they thought was shocking the other individual until he stopped making noise, which I presume indicated that he had a heart attack. So it was really sobering. Milgram has been repeated a number of times with similar outcomes. And it was an interesting demonstration of the extent to which social factors, and specifically authority, will influence people to behave in ethical or unethical manners. A third factor worth considering is opportunity. So if you've ever brought a blouse or shirt back to the mall because it didn't fit or wasn't the right color for you, you may have noticed that they generally have a manager come over and sign off on that return. You may also have noticed that if you ever stop off for fast food, there's 2 windows. Back in the day, there was only 1 window. And you may or may not have asked yourself, why is there 2 windows? Well, I'll tell you why on both counts. It's for opportunity. It's possible that 2 fast food employees could collude and say, oh, there's Ted from my biology class, let's give him a burrito for free. But it's not very common to have 2 or more employees colluding. However, it is somewhat common to have 1 employee doing the wrong thing if they're given the opportunity. So levels of ethical behavior can be examined at the individual level, the social level, and the opportunity level. And these have some really important implications for some of the suggestions, which we'll talk about shortly, in terms of encouraging ethical behavior within an organization. So some of the factors that are considered are, does the corporation have a code of conduct? And that really speaks to social factors. It's actually quite surprising how effective pointing to the code of conduct is in terms of shaping people's behavior. So I'm going to put the link up for you to Bernie Madoff. And I'd like to try something really different that I've never actually done before, so this should be interesting, is I'd like to have the folks with a last name that starts with A, B, C, or D address the question, what factors would be at work to allow something like the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme to be as successful as it was for as long as it was? I'd like you to address that in the discussion forum. I think that would be really, really interesting. Okay, moving on. We will come back to Sarbanes-Oxley when we look at the accounting chapter. But for now, I want to mention it because it was a really, really sweeping legal change as a result of issues like Enron and some other corporate fraud. And one of the elements that pertains very, very directly to Chapter 2 was the protection for whistleblowers. So I've alluded to Enron a couple times, and without going into it in the interest of time, it was a fairly massive accounting fraud situation. And the whistleblower in that was VP Sherry Watkins, who started noticing some anomalies in the accounting. And so she brought it up in an anonymous fashion. Then within a week, she identified herself. And the really, really interesting part was the first reaction or first response on the part of the then CEO, Ken Lay, was his first thought was let's fire her. But the lawyers talked him out of it because they said, if you do, you're going to file a wrongful dismissal suit and all the accounting can be brought out in court. So as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley, or I should say in Sarbanes-Oxley, there is a provision that provides whistleblower protection. But the interesting thing is it just applies to publicly traded companies. But nonetheless, it's a very, very important protection for whistleblowers. Okay, so this makes the point that trade associations can be helpful in terms of providing ethical guidelines to their members. I mentioned a code of ethics as a written document. That's useful for a couple of things. I mean, number one is on the social level is you're conveying the point that ethics really matter in the organization. And number two, you're spelling out some areas in case employees do have legitimate questions. Case in point, a very, very long time ago, I was a buyer for an organization, and one of my colleagues accepted very, very, very expensive baseball tickets, which I thought was kind of sleazy. So the hope is that a code of ethics would kind of spell out, is that okay or is that not okay? And then last, if an employee does do something unethical, it's helpful to have a written code of ethics so that the organization can point to it and say, you know what, the guy just went out on his own. We certainly don't hold those values. So some bits on code of ethics that you may find of interest, some examples. And as I said, I defined whistleblowing as informing the external press or government officials about unethical practices within an organization. So I'm going to go forward a little bit. I think there is a question on the test about guidelines for ethical decisions, so you may want to take a look at that. Would you be able to defend your decision in public, that sort of thing. So social responsibility is the recognition that a business is more than just a way to make a profit. It's important to be a good citizen. And I'll also include a link here that I think you'll find very interesting that kind of defines social responsibility a bit. And then I want to have us tackle some additional ethical questions because I think they'd be fascinating. So if your last name is E to I, in other words, E, F, G, H, or I, I'd like you to address in the forum this scenario. The manufacturer of a leading insect spray changes the formulation of its product to eliminate problems experienced by people allergic to some of the ingredients. That sounds good. The manufacturer does not inform consumers. That doesn't sound good. The change in the formula will make the product less effective. So, interesting, trading off those needs of differing stakeholders. Number 3 is if your last name is J through M, in other words, J, K, L, or M. I'd like you to discuss the scenario that you see in front of you. A bribe is paid to a company official in the island of Kokomo to facilitate the movement of a product in that country. Bribes are a normal and expected business practice in Kokomo. Is that, is it okay for your company to pay one or not? And then number 4, for people whose last name starts with N through R, which is N, O, P, Q, or R. And that's the scenario with the beer company. The beer company engages in an advertising campaign that is targeted to undergraduate college students, many of whom are under the legal drinking age. Good, bad, or indifferent. What do you think? Number 5 is the rental car company, which advises customers to purchase insurance when renting a car. Although most personal car insurance covers the insured motorist when driving a rental car, most rental car consumers are not aware of this. And having rented cars myself, I know they do tend to push that. And then last but not least, to bring it back to Uber, which is a fascinating and timely issue, I'm going to put up a couple of links to that as well. In that, oh my gosh, aside from just the CEO going on his rant, which truthfully I didn't think was that bad, they've run into some issues that are really, really bad lately. So I'm going to put a couple of links there. And then this is for the folks at the end of the alphabet, the W through Z, which is W, X, Y, or Z, if your last name ends with that. Hopefully you've got a few of those because you've got a fascinating question. What should Uber be doing to kind of rehabilitate their image, which is currently in tatters? So I look forward to a really fascinating discussion this week, and I can't wait to see you online.